All right, so first of all, happy 4th of July, Independence Day. We are very happy and grateful to live in this free land, and we're going to celebrate by exercising our freedom, our constitutional rights to assemble and to practice our religion and to say whatever we want, as long as we're not hurting anybody. Okay. How was that a good intro, like segue? Okay. Thank you. All right.
Incorporated the holidays.
Yes. Okay.
Not hurting anybody, but you can hurt their feelings.
You can hurt their feelings? Okay. So what is it? My right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins? We are saying not where your feelings begin. Okay. By the way, Al Pi Torah, we're a little bit more machmer, because there is such a thing called Einis Dvarim. Yeah, Einah, which means to hurt somebody or to afflict them. So, which is quite separate from inflicting bodily damage. Chiefly describes monetary damage done to somebody, not through destroying their property, which is a different area of Jewish law, but by giving them a bad deal in business. And then there's also something called Einos Devarim, which means hurting them through speech, hurtful speech. So I'm glad you mentioned this, because constitutionally, probably as Americans, we are allowed to hurt people's feelings. But as Jews, unfortunately, that mean old Torah is not going to let us be mean to each other. What a mean Torah. It won't let us be mean to each other. Okay. Okay. Anyways, so yeah, be nice to each other. All right. What? Can you take it? Yeah, go ahead. Sure. All right. Just remember, anything that you say out loud will eventually be heard on YouTube, because the videos roll. This is what the laptop is. The laptop is the YouTube. Okay. So don't say anything incriminating or hurtful. Although as an American, you have every right to hurt people's feelings. But as a Jew, you're not. Okay. You know, we should have a whole class about constitutional rights that we are forbidden from expressing as Jews. Yeah. Hurting people's feelings. I was just saying that. Abortion, yeah. Well, that's a very non-inflammatory, controversial. That's a very simple. Yeah, that's not a complicated discussion. Does secular thinking, or does American policy about abortion align with halacha?
It's not a constitutional right anymore.
Well, in New York, state by state.
Not a constitutional right.
Constitution.
Could there be a case? I'm just asking a question. Could there be a case where a Jewish woman asks her Orthodox rabbi for a halachic decision about an abortion, and he tells her that she may in fact receive an abortion, or maybe even is obligated to do so, and that in a particular state that act would be illegal? So it's interesting that there could actually be something that, according to American law, you're not allowed to do, and according to halacha, you are allowed to do. And conversely, there are things that, according to American law, you are allowed to do, and according to halacha, you're not allowed to do. So just remember that, patriots. We're very grateful to be here, but do not assume that the Constitution or federal or state or municipal law, ordinances, statutes, and whatever are consistent, lahavdil, we still use that word, with halacha. Sad that even needs to be said, but okay. All right. So remember, we're in the middle of a long string of chapters. that began with Perek Yud Ches. And you remember the purpose of these chapters. What's it? Come on, ladies. I'm not going to talk about Are you talking about the controversial stuff about Constitution, abortion, and like?
No, I.
What?
My opinion as far as like asking permission or whatever for I would say it's always easier to ask for forgiveness.
Say louder. What?
It's always easier to ask for forgiveness than permission if there's something you know that you need to do.
Oh, they're saying just general wisdom in life.
Right, then I said that everything's okay.
Okay, well, I'm glad I asked you what you're talking about, because I would have missed out on that. That's good stuff. Okay. All right. By the way, if anyone on YouTube just heard that statement, B'diavad, everything's okay, that's not true. I don't want to express any tacit approval by not. It's not true. But you were saying that humorously.
I was always in the back of the class.
Okay.
Unless I went out to be under the
She's so raised back into emotion.
Okay.
No doubt. I don't get into the principle. I don't go.
Okay. So, Perek Yud Ches, chapter 18 of Tanya, we started a discussion, which was about how to get ourselves emotionally aligned with the behaviors that we're committed to. Now, in chapters Tezayin, Yudzayin, 16, 17, we spoke about how to achieve emotional alignment through generating new feelings of love and awe of God through a process called meditation. But in chapter 18, we started a whole long discussion about how can you bring out some emotions, love and awe of Hashem, if you're not able to do it through meditation. Right? Okay. So we said, well, it's going to take a real long time to explain it. But the basic idea is, rather than generating new love and awe, you're going to you're going to access some emotions that are already there, that are latent in your heart. How did they get there? We explained already that they're called a Yerusha, an inheritance that we got from whom? From the Aves, from our patriarchs. They gave us a spiritual DNA. In that spiritual DNA there's something called an Ava Mesuteres, a hidden love. Why is it called hidden? Because it's hidden. It's not always active. But when does it get activated? The Alter Rebbe tells us. At a time of serious, intense distress of basically a life and death situation, where we have, unfortunately, thousands, maybe millions of examples through history where Jews who were not observant, that's the emphasis here, Jews who were not observant all of a sudden give up their lives to remain true to Judaism. And we have to explain that phenomenon. And the way we explain it is that there's this super Jew trigger that in a case of real serious life and death, where the stakes are very, very clear that we're facing being cut off from God, so there's this force within us that will not allow us to be cut off from God. Now, what good does that do me on a day-to-day basis under ordinary circumstances? That's what takes 8 chapters to explain. Because if there were a way to access that intensity under normal conditions, then I would have a new method of getting some emotional alignment when it's needed. You following? Yeah? Okay, because I've told you this summary how many times now? When we started 18, when we did 19, last week when we did 20. Okay, now this is the 4th time I've given you this summary. Now yeah?
Just as a small side point question.
Yeah.
Last week when Rabbi Zakutinsky was talking about transmitting from the Rebbe to the Chassid,
Yeah.
and they couldn't put words to that,
Yeah.
I kept thinking Ahava Mesuteres. Is that what the Rebbe is transmitting to the Chassid?
Okay, that's a great question. It's part of it. It's part of it. There's much more to it. There's definitely an aspect of that. I believe I'm going to give myself 30 seconds to go off topic, and then I'm going to make a hard stop. I believe the way that the Lubavitcher Rebbe accessed what we call the Pintele Yid, or the Ava Mesuteris, in every single Jew, was by sending us out into the street corners to ask people, excuse me, sir, are you Jewish? Excuse me, ma'am, are you Jewish? I believe that the abruptness and the somewhat brashness of that question is triggering. Jonathan Sachs said, how could we live in a world post-Hitler? He said that Rebbe's answer was, the only response is just like every single Jew had been hunted down in hate to seek out every last Jew in love. Wow. So, yeah, I do believe when you ask someone, excuse me, sir, are you Jewish? That is an inversion of, unfortunately, a phenomenon that happened throughout history of Jews being identified and targeted as Jews. I do believe it triggers some type of an epigenetic reaction. I don't mean epigenetics in the physiological sense, but in the spiritual sense and in the metaphysical sense. And yes, I do believe that's the Ava Mesuteris that's described in chapters 18 and 19 of Tanya. Okay, that was 45 seconds. So chapter 18, we said we have this latent love that we inherited from the patriarchs. Chapter 19, we spoke about the flame. Remember the metaphor of the flame. The flame wants to go up, even though it'll lose its identity, but that's the nature of fire. So too, metaphorically, it's a metaphor. The soul wants to lose itself. It doesn't want to be a separate entity, a distinct entity separate from God. It wants to be subsumed within the oneness. That is the underlying nature of the godly soul, is that it wants to be one with God at all costs. At all costs. Okay. And that's what's being triggered in the intense moment where they say worship idols or we kill you. In chapter 20, we introduced a statement that all of Torah could be condensed into two big ideas, which coincide with the first two Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, which is the commandment to believe in God, and there shall be no other gods, which is the prohibition, the negative commandment, not to believe in any other gods. So basically, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is, you can simplify or distill the entirety of all of Torah into a binary system of either you are affirming God's oneness or, God forbid, you're denying it. One or the other. In other words, I'm foreshadowing here, I'm giving it away, but the Alter Rebbe said, when are you going to achieve this intense emotional alignment? When you feel like you're being threatened with being cut off from God and being told to worship idols. But how can I have that intensity when it's not about worshiping idols? It's about eating before Havdalah. I just threw that out as an example. I'm not giving you suggestions of which Avedas to take lightly, but just giving you an example. How can I trigger that intensity under a, so to speak, under ordinary conditions? So the answer is, if you can realize that every mitzvah is really an all or nothing proposition. Either at this moment you are affirming God's everythingness or denying it, God forbid. Remember that last week? So the way we began to sort of ease into this concept is we spoke about speech. Remember? Speech, divine speech. That God is creating the world through speech. God speaks the world into being. And speech really has no substance. Speech has no substance. So the reality of creation is really completely, should we call it subjective? And the only objective reality and the only absolute reality is God. So his reality is absolute and total. And any other perceived reality, as an entity distinct from God's absolute total reality would be, God forbid, some type of an infringement upon his absolute total reality. That was last week. You see where we're going. You see where we're headed, right? We've got to get ourselves to a point where we can philosophically be comfortable with the idea, philosophically and theologically be comfortable with the idea that any deviation from God's will as outlined in the Torah, both biblical commandments as well as rabbinic enactments, any deviation is a disconnect from his totality and tantamount, therefore, to a rejection of his everythingness that we refer to as idol worship. And you would never worship an idol. You would rather die before you worship an idol. And that's how we're getting ourselves pumped up, is by viewing everything in this very intense way. Okay? All right, so here's Perek Chaf Aleph, chapter 21. V'hinei midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheleika midas basar v'dam. Now Hashem's ways, his attributes, are not like the ways of man, of flesh and blood. Why are we saying this? Because chapter 20 was an extended metaphor. Basically, the entire chapter 20 was talking about creation, metaphorically, as God's speech. And the purpose of the metaphor was that speech has no substance. So creation really is insignificant relative to God's existence. But now we take a turn. And we say, well, really, that metaphor, that whole chapter 20, it wasn't very exact, was it? Because how can you compare divine speech to human speech, which is a completely different phenomenon? When a person speaks, his breath of his speech in his mouth is perceived as something separate from him. Namely, the 10 soul powers, the faculties of his soul. In other words, you can distinguish between the person himself or his spiritual makeup and the speech that he's producing, which isn't him. It's not me, it's my speech. I produced my speech, but my speech and I are distinct and discrete from each other. However, Hashem, his speech is not removed from him whatsoever, God forbid, because nothing exists outside of him, and there is no place devoid of him. So, we produce speech. Our speech comes out of us. How does anything come out of Hashem? There's no outside. Because he is everything and everywhere. No place is devoid of him. So how can anything be described as being distinct from him? Human speech, there's the speaker and there's the speech. With Hashem, there's no such thing. That's why his speech, his blessed speech, is not like our speech. God forbid, just like his thought is not like our thought. Like it says, the prophet says, my thoughts, Hashem says, my thoughts are not like your thoughts. My ways, so too my ways, Hashem says, are removed from your ways. All right, great. So basically you said that the whole chapter 20 wasn't really accurate. So why did we do it? So the reason we refer to his speech as speech, Rak al derech mashal is only a metaphor. Because speech reveals to the listener that which had been hidden in the recesses of the mind of the speaker. In other words, there are two aspects of speech, human speech: the objective and the subjective. The objective aspect of, or quality of human speech, is that it is a product of the person, not the person himself. That's the objective. The subjective quality, the subjective quality of human speech is that the listener is able to hear what was unheard, what they didn't know before it was spoken. In the case of Hashem's speech, that objective quality of speech clearly is absent, because there's no such thing as a separation of speaker and speech. There's no such thing as the speech coming out of the speaker, because there's nothing outside of him. But the subjective quality is very much present. And that is, as we said, that speech is the mechanism by which the listener becomes privy to that which the speaker only knew before it was spoken. So let's just finish the sentence here. Kach l'mayla, so too in terms of Hashem, be'ein of Baruch Hu, speaking of the infinite, blessed be He. Yitzia sa'or v'achayis me'onu yisbarach, when the light, the creative light, comes out of Him. Ma'helam el agilui, from concealed to revealed, states. Livrei elam esilahachayim, to create worlds and to enliven worlds. Nikras b'shem dibor, that's called speech. You follow what it's saying? In as much as human speech is distinct from a human, there's the speaker and the speech, that comparison obviously will not apply to divine speech. But the subjective aspect of speech, meaning the way that speech is experienced by the listener, that part of the metaphor holds up, and that's why we use the metaphor, and that's why we're comfortable calling God's creativity speech. Because just like when a speaker speaks, the listener now knows what the speaker was thinking before they said it, but they wouldn't have known until the speaker said it. So too, when Hashem creates, He reveals to us that which He already knew, He already had, but from our perspective, it emerges and becomes revealed. So that part of speech, or that quality, or that property of speech, is what we are referring to when we refer to Hashem's creativity as speech. Okay, but the main point to understand is that there is no separation between Hashem and His speech, even though with human speech there's the speaker and the speech. However, from a purely subjective standpoint, we, the created beings, do experience His creative self-expression in a way that can be metaphorically described as speech. What you're winning, yeah.
I don't understand the first part.
Talk really loud.
The objective part of speech means that there is something that comes out of the speaker.
Yeah.
So God does speak. There's something that comes out of him. The fact that it's so
Nothing comes out of Him because there's no out of Him. Wherever you go, you're never getting out of Hashem.
so it's just an extension. It's him.
It's just more Him. Everywhere you go, it's more and more Him. Yeah.
And there's also this concept that when we speak, we also create worlds and angels, right? That there's a concept that human speech creates something, right? It's not like it's just thin air coming out of us. It's a different point, but is that what it means?
Yes, but right now we're focused on the lack in the exact parallel between the human example that we were using and the paradigm that we're trying to describe with that example. Yeah?
When we use our speech,
Yeah.
is that our ability to reveal light?
Yeah, so I don't want to get hung up on human speech here because the whole point of this chapter is how Hashem's speech is unlike human speech. But yes, really, this is going to distract everyone in a terrible way. But I held myself back from saying because it is so confusing. But I've just gone on for the past 5 minutes explaining why are we comfortable using the word speech to describe God's creativity when we know it's nothing like our speech, or I shouldn't say nothing like our speech, but in a significant way, divine speech cannot be compared to human speech. But yet, there's a significant way in which they are comparable, and it's helpful to use that metaphor. And I've been going on and on for the past 5 minutes and holding myself back from saying, guys, by the way, you do know that the real speech is Hashem's speech, and ours is the one which metaphorically resembles his paradigmatic speech. Real speech is Hashem's speech, and when we speak, we're emulating him. But anyways, I don't want to go off into a discussion about the power of human speech.
I just wonder, so the emulation of
Yeah.
us speaking in a holy way,
Yes.
rather than the way we speak.
Before you walked in, I said, Happy 4th of July. You have a constitutional right to offend people, but Al Pitoida, you're not allowed to. That's
How we speak would not be really light. Because
right. But let's not. Yesterday I went to Crown Heights and I was speaking to like 200 shluchim who teach Torah classes, and one of the questions they asked me was, how do you keep people from going off topic in class? You want to know what I told them? So, for sure you can. Absolutely. I told them, I'll tell you what I told them. I said, when you're the teacher, you must know extremely clearly before you start class where you need to get to and what the one main point, and don't have 2 points, because if you have 2 main points, you have 0 main points. You have to know what's the main point you're trying to express today, and then you could know how much other stuff you can incorporate into getting there, and also you can know what stuff's really interesting and cool but is not going to help us get there or even will take us away from there. So yeah, anyways, I know that the point of chapter 21 is to help us understand divine unity, and it's not a discussion whatsoever of respecting our own capacity as creators to put out positive energy through speech, even though that's a wonderfully fascinating topic, but that's not the point here. So the point is, remember, we started in chapter 18. We need to trigger this latent love. The latent love we know will be triggered if there's a life and death, a spiritual life and death, and physical life and death proposition of either choose physical death or choose spiritual death. And then all of a sudden we'll get this intense emotional reaction. We're trying to figure out how to tap into that. Well, we said in the previous chapter, chapter 20, really all mitzvahs can be boiled down to a binary decision between worshiping God or, God forbid, rejecting God. Well, come on. There are 613 commandments, not 2 commandments. How are you going to oversimplify it like that? So this is a quest to defend that oversimplification and actually prove it's not an oversimplification. So the way that he defends it is by saying, look, first you have to understand, what does it mean, idolatry? Idolatry means rejecting God's totality, his oneness. Okay, now you have to understand, what is God's totality? What is God's oneness? So now he's explaining this whole deep cosmological explanation about the relative non-existence of created reality, and that God is the only existence. And even though this is really deep stuff, and it's theology, and on its own it doesn't belong in this book. The first volume of Tanya, 53 chapters of Sefer Shel Beinanim, are about personal development, not about cosmology, not about the nature of reality. So this discussion only has place in as much as it's a building block to get ourselves to react in a new way to moral choices, where we will view moral choices in an extremely black and white way. And like we said last week, remember what I said last week? Remember? I'm going to warn everyone again. Do not say to me, but Rabbi, I thought we're supposed to not look at it all or nothing. We're supposed to take baby steps and you do a little bit more. And the answer to that is, yes, you're right. But that's not this method. We're learning a particular method right now. This is a very specific method. Okay. So we just said we refer to Hashem's speech as speech, even though in a very significant way it transcends one of the major properties of human speech, which is the idea of it coming out of the speaker and taking on an identity distinct from the speaker. That does not apply to divine speech. However, the subjective aspect that Hashem reveals to us creation so that we can experience it, that's very much speech. In fact, that is the paradigm of speech. All right. So this creative expression are the 10 utterances, let there be, the 10 let there be's from Genesis. As well as all the other divine speech which is written in the Bible. Now, Hashem's speech and his thought are united with him in the most absolute sense of oneness. Derech mashal, for instance, or by way of allegory, when a person hasn't yet expressed himself, not as speech and not even yet as thought, but he has the proto-thought, he has the material or even the capacity for that thought in his mind, but not yet articulated even as thought, let alone speech. That would be closer, that would be more akin to the nature of oneness of Hashem's speech to him, even after he has, quote unquote, spoken it. In fact, we can go even deeper. Remember, we learned about in the last chapter, there's a I wouldn't even call it necessarily an emotion, but there's a drive in the heart, an attraction to something, a visceral response that hasn't even entered the cerebral brain to even be processed in any type of intelligent way. So we're talking about, imagine a person speaks about something, but before he spoke about it, he thought about it. But before he even thought about it, he had the idea of it, or even before that, he had a visceral reaction to it. So what we're saying is, our speech goes through a process of being pushed outward, level by level by level, increasingly articulated. And the helpful way for us to understand how Hashem's speech is one with Him is think about the potential, the drive or the energy that you felt that ultimately, after undergoing a series of processes, yields speech. But if you would trace it back to its original state before any of those processes began, that would be like the oneness of Hashem's speech with Him, even after He has quote-unquote spoken it. So you think about something that you don't even have words for in your brain yet, let alone words to speak to someone else. It's just sort of like I don't know, I wouldn't even call it a subconscious or unconscious thought. It's not even a thought. It's like a feeling, a proclivity, predilection. I'm not even sure what to call it, but it's really, it certainly doesn't have any type of real identifiable quality to it because it's just so embedded in who you are. And then it undergoes different processes where you give it an increasing amount of articulation until finally you can put it out there. That's what we call it, putting it out there. But imagine Hashem's speech, even after He's put it out there, it remains completely embedded within who He is. What do you want to say? Yeah.
Is this like the Chachma, Bina, and Das? You mentioned something like it's the inspiration and then the actual intuition.
So if you want to get micro, then you're asking about Chochmah Bina Das. Yes, the process. When I keep referring vaguely to these processes, one phase would be yes, the Chochmah Bina Das. Yes, correct. You're correct. I don't want to go into it in depth because it'll take us away from the focus. But you're correct. Yes.
It's correct that the speech goes through that process.
The speech doesn't go through that process, but the speech is the result of that process. That makes sense? Yeah. The speech is the end result of many processes, including the Chochmah Bina Das process. Okay? Yes.
But what we're talking about now is a potential latentness. Like it's latent in the brain,
Yeah.
and it's before it actually comes out into thought, and that's
Right.
where Hashem's divine speech stays
Right.
and can stay shameless.
Correct. Yes.
I have a mental blockage, but let me know if this is off topic.
Okay.
If we're created from God's speech, which is one with Him that doesn't change, how do we have ability to change as creation?
Okay, so you're asking another philosophical question, which is if we're created through Hashem's speech, which is one with Him, and He does not change, then how can we change? Simple, quick answer is that because He is above time, then none of that is change. For Him. Okay?
Can you say that again?
Because He is above change can only exist within time. There's no concept of change without time. For Him, whatever will be always was. Good enough? Because we're already trying to wrap our heads around a deep concept, so I don't want to get. But is it satisfying enough?
No, but it's
No.
something that will be
Okay.
discussed later because that's a way.
Will it be discussed later? Well, it's not really a discussion in Tanya, because that's not the job of Tanya. It's discussed at length elsewhere in Chassidus. But remember, it's so easy. Tanya is such a rich book, and there are so many points where you could get drawn into a side conversation. Remember what the point is right here. we're trying we're trying to understand divine unity well enough to frame all moral choices as a binary decision of being connected, absolutely connected, or absolutely, God forbid, disconnected.
So Rabbi,
Yeah.
just by saying that, binary choice splits us into two, where we have iterated pieces. Hashem is one.
Okay, so you're asking very good. Binary choice, that means one or the other. But God is one. So where's the other? Okay. Okay, not only it's a valid question, now that you brought it up, I have to address it.
Meaning God's in both choices.
What we're talking about here is our subjective experience. Okay?
Of will it elevate our soul or not?
Will it you could
Connect our soul.
connect? I would use the word connection.
Just
Like the
Hashem
Kotzker Rav said as a child. They asked him, where is God? He said, wherever you let him in.
But just like we said, God is also in the Klipas rod, the phone that's tied down.
Right. Concealed, yes. God is concealed even
Even
in,
the hand sandwich.
yes, concealed in everything. Which, by the way, is a whole discussion, a whole deep discussion about the nature of Tzimtzum. The Arizal introduced the concept of Tzimtzum, that Hashem is, literally Tzimtzum is compression or condensation. And then there was a whole big disagreement whether that means that God removed himself from the space where creation takes place, or whether God is present but in a concealed way. Right, is he really moved aside? Is it real siluk? Or is he behelim? Is he simply concealed or hidden? Okay, but yes, we're talking about our subjective experience. Because remember, we said divine speech, from the subjective standpoint, divine speech does resemble human speech, inasmuch as there is an experience of a listener. There's something, whether it's absolute reality or not, the listener is having an experience. And that's what we're describing. When we're describing creation, we're really describing a subjective experience. When we're talking about creation, we're talking about a subjective experience that creation is having. Not of an absolute reality, because that would imply that God has somehow undergone a change.
It's the difference between subjective and absolute.
I believe so, yeah. All right, let's continue here. Yeah, so we're describing the speech before it was even speech, before it was thought. Sha'oz hoyu eisius machshava v'hadibra zeh hanimshachas mechemda v'tshukra b'keich b'leiv. Back when the speech, before it was ever articulated, even as a thought, and it was only emotional energy. Back then it was completely one with God. Namely, the capacity of Chokhmah in his mind and the desire in his heart. Talking about with a person. I love that expression, by the way. Kocha mamish means literally, and derech mashal means figuratively. Literally, figuratively. That's how everyone uses the word literally now anyways. He literally dropped a bomb on my head. Really? You mean figuratively? I mean, that's what I mean. Maybe that's the source for it. The world is becoming more Hasidic. Hashem's speech and thought are totally one with him. Even after his speech comes out and creates worlds. Just like his speech was one with him before he spoke it out. There's no change for him. From his perspective, there's no change. The change is only from the subjective standpoint of the created beings, which receive their existence from his speech. They're the ones who are changed by the exiting, the coming out, the articulation of his speech to create worlds. His speech is invested in the worlds to enliven them. And that's through a process that's not even one speech. It's like a carbon copy of a carbon copy. He calls it Hishtalshlus, Me'ilul La'olol, Medreges, Yuridus HaMedreges, Tzimtzumim Rabim, Vatsumim, Vashoinim. Basically, it's not even one speech, like the telephone game. Ad sheyuchlu abruim lekabel chayusim v'hishavusam mimenu v'le yisbatlu b'mitzias, until the chayus, until the divine creative energy is muted enough, diminished enough in grade, that the created beings will be able to receive from it without being overwhelmed out of existence. V'chol hatzimtzumim heim bechinas hester panim. All of these tzimtzumim, these contractions, are actually concealments. We mentioned that earlier. All of them, what do they accomplish? They conceal the light and the vitality which comes from his speech, so that it doesn't become so revealed that the lower realms cannot bear. They cannot tolerate it. And that's why the created beings perceive Hashem's creative energy, the very creative energy which is invested in them. The creative beings perceive it as if it is something discrete from his essence. Even though we just got through this whole long explanation that his speech, meaning his creative energy, never becomes separate from him. It never leaves him. There's nowhere to go because he is everywhere and everything. Yet, from our subjective standpoint, it does feel that way. Yeah.
Could it be that the tzimtzumim, for us then, distort our perception?
I don't know.
We can't see absolute.
They create. I don't want to use the word distort, but it creates an alternate reality. And what? I don't want to call it an illusion, because then you're saying the world is just a dream.
No, I'm saying that
And we know that the world is real. Bereshis bara Elokim, Eis Shemai Ve'es Haaretz.
it's real, but our perception of bad is just an illusion.
Why are you running to bad? Why do you have to run to bad? Why do you have to run to an extreme thing?
Because the good is
You're making this about good and bad. Why don't we start with something more basic? Why don't we start with something much more basic before you run to moral terms like good and bad, which can be very muddy. Let's start with something more basic.
Okay.
Our perception of any reality apart from divine unity. Is that an illusion? Or is it a particular subjective standpoint which the Infinite One has purposefully generated? It's not an illusion, it's not a joke, it's not a dream, it's not a trick, but it's a limited perspective. And one of the reasons we learn these subjects is to continue to bear in mind that it's only a perspective.
And our job is to get to the end.
Okay, but let's keep going here. Let's finish. Okay, so I was in the middle of a sentence. So this speech, we see it as if divine speech has become separate and distinct from God. We erroneously perceive his speech as coming from him, meaning we perceive like a person speaks. There's the speaker and the speech. So we look at the world, even if we're believers, we say, well, there's God and there's God's world, which is really not correct. There's just God. But from a subjective standpoint, yes, he successfully created an experience where it does seem, you're not crazy for saying that it seems like the speaker and the speech are separate, that God created creation and that they're two different entities. Yes, he did create such an appearance. He did. We're affirming the fact. He did create that appearance. However, you have to know the truth. Lagabe Kodesh Baruch Hu, from Hashem's perspective, Ein shum tzimtzum v'hester v'helam master u'maylam lefonav. No tzimtzum, no contractions can conceal before him. V'chachashecha ka'era, for darkness is like light. For him, there's no difference between darkness and light. He can see in the dark just as much as in the light. Like it says, even darkness doesn't obscure for you. Why? Because all these contractions and concealments or garments are not separate from him. It's not that he's hiding behind something other than himself. Ella, but rather, here's the metaphor, Gehadein kamtza, like the snail, or some people translate it as the turtle. Either way it works. The levushei mineu bei, whose clothing come from it itself. How can you distinguish between the turtle and the turtle shell? It's not like a person who wears clothing or drives a car or lives in a house. The turtle shell and the turtle are one thing. The turtle shell is part of the turtle. So Hashem's hiding behind something. But what's he hiding behind? Himself. So, from our perspective, I don't see the turtle. I only see the turtle shell. But from the turtle's perspective, the shell doesn't separate me from myself. Kamesha Kosov, Ki Hashem Hu Elokim, like it says, Hashem, which is Yud Ke Vav Ke, the four-letter name, Ha-Yehovah V'Yeh, was, is, and will be, the eternal one, the transcendent one, is Elokim. Elokim is the divine name which corresponds to God's hidden power within the natural realm. That's why Elokim, the divine name, has the same numerical value as Hateva, the nature. So Havaya is Elokim, that the transcendent God hides behind this concealment, which is just another aspect of himself. So he's hiding behind himself. Like it's explained elsewhere, definitely the second volume of Tanya, Shara Yichud V'Amunah, explains all this stuff at length. You guys are all pretending to be so interested in this topic now, but if I would give a class in Shara Yichud V'Amunah, you'd see in 2 weeks I'd have nobody here. Remember when you get to the end of the 53 chapters. Okay, let's just finish off the last few words. V'lochin kamei, therefore, from his perspective, kula kaloi choshiv mamish, everything is like nothing. So therefore, what's the point? What's the point? God speaks worlds into being, but his speaking them into being doesn't actually make them an entity unto themselves, like human speech, where the speech and the speaker are distinct from each other, but rather, even after having spoken the world into being, even after creation has emerged, so to speak, from God's essence, it still remains one with him. Why is this important? Because remember where we're headed. We're headed toward a very extreme view of Hashem's totality. And that, we didn't say this yet, but we're going to say it. We're going to redefine idolatry, and in fact, we're going to redefine all sin. Not merely as rebelling against God's will, but we're going to define it as a denial of God's everythingness, which we've now defined. We've now defined his everythingness. His everythingness is, just so you understand, what last chapter, chapter 20, and today's chapter, chapter 21 have done. They've defined God's everythingness as that which remains itself even after having created an appearance of separation. The fact that it appears like there's God and God's creation is not God's reality. That's a subjective, created reality. Yeah?
It seems to me like this chapter is the first point of the first method of getting close to Hashem through love for meditators.
No, because we're not meditating on this.
But when
You could you're right. You're right. And later on, by the way, we will meditate on this subject, and it will bring us to love and awe of God. It's very interesting you're saying, because you could take this same subject matter and meditate on it and create new love and awe of God based on think about this concept, but that's not what we're doing. Right now we're studying it to get us into a mode of thinking where it's very, very extreme and all or nothing.
And I had another one. It seems like in this chapter, it describes the process of Hashem's speech through like thought and speech, and it takes away the emotion. And for us, the emotion is.
No, he mentioned the emotion. He mentioned it. He said it.
In Hashem.
Yeah, he said, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. It's all part of the, yeah.
The rabbi ended with, this is a subjective creative reality. It is a subjective creative reality, but because if it remains itself even after creating an appearance of separation, that's not a subjective creative reality. Isn't that the objective creative reality?
Well, let me simplify it. If I were to ask you, does it appear that not only God and his world are two distinct entities, but the world itself is made up of many distinct entities? I think the honest answer would be that yes, according to my five senses, and according to the brain I'm using to interpret the data that I'm getting from those senses, Yes, it does appear so. Okay? All right. Happy 4th of July once again. Please stay safe. I know you guys are very into your M80s and your cherry bombs, bottle rockets, but please, ladies, stay safe. It's better to just go to a municipal fireworks, let the real pros handle it.